Welcome once again to High Desert Radio, the voice of the Jewish Federation of New Mexico. I'm David Wolf. Today, Federation Executive Director Zach Benjamin sits down with Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Iran Analyst at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, to discuss the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, 2 years after its adoption. Even now, American Jews are still divided over the deal's effectiveness and whether it has eased or exacerbated the threat Iran poses to the Sunni Gulf states, Israel, and the United States. Today, we'll receive an update on the status of the deal and its impact on the broader Middle East. We'll discuss how Iran's behavior under the deal has influenced the activities of other regional actors, how the deal has impacted Iran's ability to fund Hamas and other terrorist organizations, and whether a possible renegotiation of the deal would mitigate Iran's rise as a threat to its adversaries. Here's Zachary Benjamin.
Behnam Ben Taleblu from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We're quite pleased to have you with us today. Foundation for Defense of Democracies is a fantastic organization, and we've worked with some of your colleagues before, and many of our sister organizations have as well. Before we get started, I just want to wish all of our listeners a belated Shana Tova. Certainly all of us at Federation hope you had a sweet new year and a reflective and restorative Yom Kippur. But here we are. We're back at it. Very pleased to have Senior Iran Analyst Behnam Ben Taleblu with us from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for the kind words about FGD. I totally agree. It's been 5 years here at the Foundation, and been loving the team that I work with, and glad they got to work with the Federation and its branches.
Well, we're pleased to have you, and last year, Jonathan Schanzer visited our community and spoke at an event here, and we had a wonderful conversation over brunch before his presentation. And so when we established this new High Desert Radio podcast, one of the first thoughts that came to mind was having someone from your organization provide us with an update on regional affairs. It's certainly an interesting time, so we're pleased to have you. Jumping right in, today I think the gist of our conversation is going to be really an update on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran deal. We're about 2 years in now, and of course there are strong feelings on both sides of the spectrum really about its success, where it's failed, what work needs to be done, and with the new administration now in place and now actually close to a year into the Trump administration, with a better idea of where they're headed and where their heads are at, I think it's timely to have an update really of where we are. So I think just to start, maybe just give us a kind of brief report card on the JCPOA, which aspects, if any, have been successful, which have failed, and regionally kind of what this all means, big picture.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was inked after a little over 2.5 years of nuclear negotiations between Iran and the P5+1. And the P5+1 are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. So that's, the U.S., the UK, France, Germany, Russia, China. And then they all negotiated with Iran, and they had this EU interlocutor that was basically based off of the framework for previous negotiations between the EU and Iran, some of which that happened in 2003, 2005, and then some of which that happened after 2008. And then once the U.S. formally embedded itself into this mechanism, the P5+1 community really congealed. And they sought this deal based on a flawed deal, unfortunately, that they had inked in November 2013, and that was called the Joint Plan of Action Nuclear Deal. And, I think that deal really set us up for the deal that we have today. That deal, unfortunately, did not deal with Iran's ongoing enrichment problem. It dealt with a small portion of Iran's enrichment capability, the 20% uranium, and basically set the predicate for the U.S. to trade sanctions relief for limited, time-sensitive nuclear concessions by Iran. Ultimately, the best argument in favor of this deal is that it's a time-delaying mechanism. It kicks the can down the road several years. Unfortunately, in my view, and in the view of several other analysts in this town, I think the cost with which it kicks the can down the road is too high, because, a deal is not about the day you ink it. The deal is always about the day after. With a deal comes implementation challenges. And even under a great deal, you will have implementation challenges. But in a flawed deal, in a fatally flawed deal, as H.R. McMaster has recently called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, you're going to have even more challenges because over time, the U.S. loses economic leverage, and over time, Iran's nuclear program is not only legalized and kind of given this blessing of legitimacy by the international community, but it's allowed to become more robust, and they're allowed to do things under the auspices of the deal in a limited fashion that could ultimately set it up to actually have that nuclear weapons capability with which we're looking to denude Iran of. So this is the predicate for which the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action nuclear deal came about. As you know, it was attained on July 2015. A Security Council resolution called 2231 was passed unanimously a few days later, codifying and enshrining this, and implementation occurred in January 2016. And here we are like you said, 2 years into the deal, and there's debates over Iranian violations of the spirit and letter of the deal. First of all, there is this artificial divide between the spirit and the letter because the deal is so poorly written. You don't have members of the P5+1 all developing a unified interpretation of the deal. Then you have, unfortunately, some not great reporting that leads to confusion. You may have seen headlines, or your members may have seen headlines, that the IAEA is saying Iran is in compliance with the deal. That is actually not what the IAEA is supposed to do. The IAEA isn't tasked with monitoring and verifying Iran's adherence to the broad technical contours of the deal. It only assesses Iran's compliance with this other accord called the Additional Protocol, which Iran is only voluntarily implementing under the auspices of the JCPOA. Compliance is actually a national decision based on every party that is a member of the deal, and an international decision attained by the Joint Commission, which is a body created by the deal that meets every so month to address implementation issues. So there's been much debate over this deal, and there is a debate now in Washington over the future of the deal and if the new administration will decertify Iran's compliance with the deal, as well as kick the issue back to Congress, and will it continue to waive sanctions. And so that's the state of play that we've reached now.
So to follow up with that answer, we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel met with Prime Minister May of Great Britain this week and discussed, among many other things, the status of the deal and the likelihood or lack thereof that the P5+1 would be amenable to rethinking the deal or perhaps as a penalty for Iran's malfeasance, pulling back to some degree on the deal. And of course, Prime Minister May felt that that wasn't on the table at this time. Is that truly the case? Is there any scenario under which you see either the U.S. unilaterally or the P5+1 collaboratively either pulling back and implementing some punitive measures or pulling out of the deal entirely?
I think the first thing I want to say is that the debate over decertification, that even Iran, members of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, including and up to Mohammad Javad Zarif, their eloquent but cunning Iranian foreign minister, has called this entire debate over certification and not certification an internal matter, an internal procedure. And why I think that's important is that we shouldn't do the heavy lifting of the Iranians for them. We shouldn't do the diplomacy of the Iranians for them. And we shouldn't, win diplomatic successes for this type of regime. And so the reason I'm saying that is because if they don't see our debates over certification to be a problem, then we certainly, and our allies certainly shouldn't see that. And that's unfortunate because most of our allies, unfortunately across the pond, have bought into the Iranian narrative that decertification is akin to a withdrawal from the deal. And that's not. Talking about the president decertifying Iran's compliance pursuant to the Iran Nuclear Review Act of this deal is not at all like pulling out of the Paris Accords unilaterally. And it's not a unilateral measure. It's simply something that it pertains to, existing U.S. legislation on how the president is supposed to be waiving sanctions and how the president determines Iran is compliant and how the president determines if remaining in the deal is in the U.S. national security interests. So this is a very nuanced debate that has been in the media and across the pond been unfortunately somewhat misunderstood. And I think it's unhelpful because Iran is using this dissonance to exploit an existing cleavage between, the transatlantic community where there may not have actually been one. You saw at the UNGA in September, both President Trump and President Macron of France, both of them hit on Iran's ballistic missile program. And I think this unity between the U.S. and Europe over fears of Iran's ballistic missiles, that they should have been included in the deal, it unfortunately wasn't, this unity could be used with some creative pressure, mind you, to perhaps, renegotiate parts of the deal or, put the deal aside and to get a new deal, perhaps a new deal on missiles. So where there is unity, Iran is trying to create dissonance. But there is unity because they all know the nature of the threats the Islamic Republic poses. You have your nuclear threats and your non-nuclear threats. And unfortunately, this deal only attempts to deal with the non-nuclear threats. And that leaves a space for the U.S. to creatively find a way to deal with non-nuclear threats.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Actually, I think it's important to draw this distinction between the cancellation of the deal or the concept of cancellation of the deal and the ability to maneuver within the deal in ways that hold Iran accountable for their actions. And I think we recently saw the passage of the Iran Sanctions Act, which simply provides access to those quote-unquote snapback sanctions. And I do think it's an important distinction that you've made here, that negotiating within the terms of the deal doesn't cancel the deal, and certainly doesn't necessarily withdraw it, and that most don't understand that there are conditions in place for additional negotiations with the deal in place.
And one of the hardest things to do in Washington right now is to not necessarily take a stance on certification or decertification, it's to take a stance on actually enforcing the deal as it is. Earlier you had mentioned, does the deal have any saving graces? There's a section in the first annex of the deal, which is the nuclear annex of the deal, Section T, that deals with weaponization-related research and technology and design. So activities like X-ray cameras that Iran has can't be used for nuclear weapons-related purposes. But the way we are currently set up right now, without access to certain military sites, without access to certain scientific individuals in Iran's overall scientific community, we won't be able to actually verify even clauses that exist in this flawed deal. And so when people say that any attempt to fix the deal or any attempt to enforce the deal is really just like a secret way of killing it, I think that's highly offensive because there are things in the deal that are already good that we are trying to fix. And it's a shame that I think some members of the international community and some in Washington continue to see any attempt to improve the deal, any attempt to actually use coercive diplomacy, any attempt to use creativity to resolve the Iranian nuclear issue as a way to simply undermine it.
Sure, and to some extent that rhetoric, that's a rhetorical device similar to what we saw during the debate over the deal itself, which certainly in our community was substantive, certainly was a necessary conversation to be had, but there were those who attempted to create essentially a bilateral construction of the deal, either of the world with or without a deal. Either a deal is in place to keep a check on Iran's ability to threaten the region and the U.S. And Israel, or we were going to war, and there was no nuance. So I think this is probably an extension of those same rhetorical devices. Switching gears a little bit, I'm particularly interested in the ripple effect that the JCPOA has had, and particularly Iran's inability to comply with certain elements of it has had on the region writ large. We've seen a fascinating standoff between Qatar and the Arab League. Qatar, of course, is well known to be one of the chief allies of Iran, one of the chief state sponsors of Hamas and Hezbollah, which themselves are heavily funded by Iran. We see Turkey and other actors positioning themselves as well. So I think the first question is, what are the key chess pieces that have been moved as a result of the deal and its relative success or lack thereof, meaning which state and non-state actors have made the most significant moves? And secondly, is the Arab League and the Sunni states, Gulf states, an effective bulwark against some of the weaknesses in the deal?
Well, that's a great question, and I think just to be able to do that, we need a bit of a 50,000 feet perspective of the order of battle and the alliances and enmities that existed in the Middle East right up to the deal. And I like to say that there were almost three axes that you could find. You saw the pro-American, and these axes are not about necessarily ideology, They're about orientation. So that's how you see Israel and Saudi Arabia in the same bloc. That's the pro-American status quo bloc. That's the first bloc. Most of the GCC states that are pro-American in terms of at least foreign and security policy, with the exception of Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, these kind of countries. Then you had the second, which was the main, the axis, if you will, which is the resistance axis or the revolutionary axis that Iran calls it, which is Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon because of Hezbollah, and then their attempts to try to get Yemen through the Houthis, and their attempt to subvert Bahrain through armed groups like Saraya al-Ashtar. So these were the two main camps. You had the pro-American camp, which is the status quo camp, and then you had the anti-American camp, which is the Iranian-led camp. And then you had two very creative, I believe John actually coined this term, neither allies nor enemies, frenemies, of Turkey and Qatar. And both these kind of countries had been playing footsie with Iran for quite a while, even though they were part of larger camps that were actually checking Iran. So Turkey is a NATO member, and NATO is not necessarily with Iran. And Qatar was part of the GCC, and the GCC overall has more of a checking posture against Iran. But both these countries have been playing footsie with Tehran through, sanctions busting schemes, through, as you know, with Qatar, for the hosting entities like Hamas, that Iran is friendly with, and engaging in behavior through illicit financial activities and engaging in behavior in terms of norms and values that the U.S. found to be at odds with itself. So you had and they tended to support abroad Muslim Brotherhood type organizations. So you see these three different axes emerge. And then with the Iran nuclear deal coming into play in summer 2015, you still see these two camps, the Iran camp and then the Saudi-Israel camp, the pro-American and anti-American camp, if you will, and they kind of solidify. And even though most of the GCC countries that are in that pro-American camp had to give lip service publicly to, oh, yes, the nuclear deal is good, I think privately everybody in this town could tell you that, it's no secret the Arab states of the Persian Gulf are upset with the U.S. over its handling of the nuclear diplomacy with Iran, over basically giving away the whole store to Iran, and then they felt the need to be bulked up, and that's when they engage on much of their arms purchases. Pivoting to Qatar more specifically, Qatar has had for a couple of years now this ongoing rivalry with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is basically believed to be the head of this GCC bloc. Qatar has sought to check that. You saw in terms of satellite diplomacy, Qatar's famous channel Al Jazeera did a lot to spread its narrative and its invective, I would say, during the Arab Spring. The different Arab states backed different factions in key battlegrounds like Egypt. A success for Sisi was seen as part of the pro-American camp, or the pro-status quo camp with Saudi Arabia, the Brotherhood. That was seen the vindication of the Qatar faction. But then on Iran, they have been at loggerheads with Iran, but Iran hasn't been able to covet the Qatar relationship until very recently. Now they're constantly saying, oh, we're the ones providing our airspace to Qatari planes. Qatar is being starved. And so Iranian English language outlets like Press TV are re-upping the narrative that Qatar has been upping about its own behavior in the region.
And I'd like to, at some point, take a closer look at Turkey as well. But just as a follow-up to to Qatar as somewhat of a linchpin in Iran's regional influence, we know, of course, Qatar is a close ally of Iran. We know that money, resources are flowing from Qatar to Hamas, certainly to Hezbollah. But on the other side of the coin, the U.S. still maintains its Al Udeid air base in Qatar, which houses much of our central command, the regional command. How does this create a bit of a conundrum for the U.S. and its allies in taking a harder line against Iran, if at all, or are they two separate issues?
On that front, I probably wouldn't be the best person to speak to on this, but I know there's been a couple of great FDD reports about looking at Qatar's role in terror finance and illicit finance, and the broader question is, if this country is part of the U.S. security architecture, how could it continue to do X, Y, Z things on illicit finance in terms of human rights And in terms of its regional posture, because ultimately the question is this country that's housing U.S. military and diplomatic facilities in the U.S. orbit, or is it playing footsie with a larger state sponsor of terrorism, Iran? Or is it playing footsie with, groups like Hamas by hosting Khaled Mashal? I'm sure, everyone knows about this. On the Hezbollah stuff, I don't know the extent of, there's Qatar's support to Lebanese Hezbollah, if at all. So, I won't comment on that. But I think that, now is the time for the U.S. to begin asking itself these questions, these cost-benefit questions. I personally am not the one to be able to answer it as best as I can because I kind of have that zero-in focus on Iran. And when we pivot out to the region, I'm much more versed in these, pro-American, anti-American orientation dynamics than, what's
Sure.
Qatar's role in the campaign against ISIS, what's Qatar's role in the campaign against the Houthis versus, its effectivity in being a check on Iran, which I think is quite weak. But there are some great FDD resources I can point you and some of your members to.
So I'd like to take a closer look at Turkey. Again, another ally of Iran, certainly another, as you and Jonathan so aptly put it, a frenemy of the U.S. and Israel of late. We know that they've been moving for a number of years in a more hardline direction under Prime Minister Erdogan. How has the JCPOA specifically influenced Turkey's actions, and where do you see Turkey headed over the course of the next several years, assuming the deal remains intact? And I guess I mean Turkey's relationship with Israel, Turkey's relationship with the United States. Are those relationships from a security standpoint, from the sharing of intelligence, in jeopardy? Is Turkey holding some of its expertise, if it has any, in terms of, again, intelligence and other resources, essentially hostage based on the Iran deal and the U.S.'s posture towards Iran?
I can't necessarily say that the Iran deal has caused all of these things in the shift in Turkey's domestic politics and foreign posture, but the Iran deal's advent and implementation neatly correlates with this ongoing trend since the AKP came into power, and more so since you saw this increasing authoritarian streak in Erdogan himself. Which is this increasing Islamization of the Turkish Republic, stuff that Ataturk, if he was elected today, would be kicking himself for. And things that would put the rest of NATO members who kind of put their faith in Turkey because, again, it has the second largest army in NATO, and, it's a buffer. It's got shares a land border with Syria. There's the whole refugee crisis. There's the question of treatment of jihadist fighters. There's all these different questions that we have vis-a-vis Turkey. There's this recent desire to purchase, the S-400 SAM system, and is that really giving, for lack of a better word, a finger to the United States? Because this is, again, a NATO-allied country. Why is it buying military hardware that will not be interoperable with existing Western hardware in Turkey? So these are raising all these red flags about just the direction Turkey is going in that don't necessarily have to do with the JCPOA. But Turkey is, as you know, energy starved. Ties with Russia have to do with energy. Ties with Tehran definitely have to do with energy. And Tehran and Ankara have looked to kind of increase their ties together, particularly to raise their joint trade balance. But there are things in the region that continue to put them apart, such as Syria. Increasingly, though, Iran has been able to kind of get Turkey to buy in to some of its regional maneuvering. In 2015, Erdogan called Iran this destabilizing force in the region. But with the advent of the coup, I think this is a more critical moment in Turkish-Iranian relations than the JCPOA. Because with the advent of the coup in the summer of 2016, which, as you know, was botched and failed, Iran, unlike the United States, did not waffle and unequivocally threw its support behind Erdogan. And there's a quote from Qasem Soleimani, the Major General of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force. And this is a quote he said in relation to Iraq and Syria, I think, in the early 2010s. But he said, "We're not like the Americans. We don't abandon our friends." So in that moment where Erdogan was looking abroad to NATO, to John Kerry in the West for support during the coup, it was Tehran that rushed to their aid and said, no, we fully back the Erdogan government. And that was a very salient moment, I would say, for Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And salient moment in the sense that that moment, I'm sure, was playing in his head as he was in Tehran a week or so ago. And that moment was in his head when, you saw the flurry of military diplomatic activity between the two countries looking to check an increasingly nationalist Kurdish population in Iraq with the referendum from September 25th of this year. So while the JCPOA may ultimately alter the macro trends of Turkey's ties to Iran because it'll say, hey, the sanctions are off, you can't accuse us of sanctions busting, you can't accuse our banks and our businessmen of sanctions busting, it'll kind of reinforce that mercantilist policy. But there are other softer geopolitical, non-economic things like Iran's support for Turkey during the coup, things like Iran's charm offensive to get them more on board with the ceasefire zones in Syria that Russia is also pushing, and things like Iran's ability to exploit Turkish fears about her independent Kurdistan that will ultimately take our NATO partner, Turkey, and make it drift a bit more towards Tehran.
To follow up before we move on to our final question, you mentioned certainly the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey changing as, of course, Turkey's posture pivots in a more Islamist, I guess you could say, direction. During the first term of the Obama administration, President Obama was quite clear that Erdogan was perhaps the leader in the region with whom he had the closest relationship, one that he trusted to help guide him in the early days of his presidency. And, of course, at the time, perhaps there was no anticipating the hardline direction that Erdogan would take later on, certainly in the Obama presidency and into the Trump presidency. Did that relationship, the early close connection between President Obama and Prime Minister Erdogan impact at all, either help soften the U.S.-Turkey relationship as Turkey pivoted away from the U.S., or did it perhaps tie the U.S.'s hands in being able to censure Turkey and act as a buffer for the NATO states against Turkey's turn towards the right?
So this question, I think, may require a bit more of an independent Turkey expert, someone who speaks Turkish and knows the nuances of Turkish domestic politics to be able to answer better than I. But what I can tell you is that in the U.S., definitely there was this desire to see something and to project something, more importantly, onto Erdogan that may not have been there to begin with. You mentioned Obama's reset with the region in 2009 and, looking to not necessarily follow in the footsteps of President Bush, who, there was the warm embrace of America's traditional partners, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the desire to save Iraq, and the desire to check Iran. And Obama had, as you know, a very different approach to the region coming into the office. And that's why I think the appeal of this kind of this nascent Islamic country that was not an Islamist state yet then, Turkey, it was a NATO ally, it was this bridge between East and West. There were all these reasons, I think, for the Obama administration to want to read in more of their narrative of the region into Erdogan, into the AKP's rise, and into Turkey's success in the region, and to be vested in Turkey's success into the region than I think ever before. And that may, I think, again, a Turkey expert will be able to tell you if this is more causal or correlative, but that may have actually hindered some of our ability to be firm with Turkey when we needed to. I think, good friends show tough love, whether it's the U.S.-Israel relationship, whether it's the Iran-Russia relationship, whether it's the China-North Korea relationship. Sure. Doesn't matter what the ideological orientation is. If you're a good friend, you'll tell it like it is. And I think we may have indulged Erdogan a bit. Again, I won't comment on to the depth of that, but there was definitely a desire in Washington in the 2009 to 2012, not limited to the administration, mind you, to much of the open source and analytical community, to read so much into Erdogan, to project so much onto Erdogan that may not have been there. And I think that's unfortunate because the way things moved in the region with the Arab Spring and the dissonance, the increasing dissonance of values and interests that we've had with Turkey over time have only been reinforced. And one wonders if we could have stopped this or if we could have had a hand in at least stemming some of this before. It's a question historians will debate. They'll say hindsight is 20/20. But I think at this level, one can only wonder as an American.
Okay, so wrapping it up, I think just kind of putting it all together, can you maybe project out between now and, we can say between now and the end of the lifetime of the deal, the 15-year time frame. What does this all mean for the U.S. and our national security, and Israel and its security? And can you give us a quick best case and worst case scenario, realistic best case and worst case scenario for both the U.S., Israel, with regard to Iran?
At the macro level, I unfortunately don't see any best cases in the short to medium term for the United States. It requires significant investment in, unfortunately, a lot of theaters of conflict that many Americans may not want to see more blood and treasure go towards, such as the Syrian conflict, or at least the fight to rid Iraq of ISIS, but then also rebuilding Iraq, and then as well as the ongoing U.S. and ISAF mission in Afghanistan. There are all these different things that will have a macro level effect on that calculus. But with respect to the deal and the timeline, should the deal hold, have Iran, if there's no major Iranian violation, no material breach, that kind of thing, no new nuclear sanctions imposed on Iran, that kind of, if you're going in that kind of vein, one of my fears is that we actually keep the deal as is, no renegotiation. Iran ups its pressure, we up our pressure. U.S.-Israeli ties so it gets solidified. Saudi-Israeli ties grow in the dark. There's all this great, background stuff going on, but then ultimately there is this macro level deal that lapses, and then after 10 to 15 years we realize that Iran has a minimal to nothing breakout timeline and is a screwdriver turn away from a nuclear weapon. And the worst thing I think that would happen then is we would discover some sort of Iranian military facility, or Iran may have some incentive to develop something or test something, because the capability is now all there because of this deal that doesn't do what it promised it would do. And the region is left to its own devices, because I think there may be not speaking for this administration, and the last administration and the administration beforehand, but there are ups and downs in the depth of the U.S. presence in the region and the level of commitment the U.S. wants to have to the Middle East. And, one only wonders that at a time when Iran would be increasingly emboldened in the region, and Iran would be increasingly vindicated in terms of its narrative and ideology of resistance in the region, it wins in Syria. It wins on the end of the nuclear deal. It gets to have, some kind of expeditionary force on the Golan Heights. It gets to have Saudi Arabia and Israel look like the marginalized actors in the region. It gets to have this NATO country, Turkey, drift towards it faster than ever before. That's a lot for the U.S. to contend with, especially when you talk about a ballistic missile embargo lapsing on Iran by 2023 and an arms embargo lapsing on Iran by 2020, with Russian and Chinese conventional weaponry pouring into Iran. These are all major fears. This is obviously a worst-case scenario. How to turn that on its head and make a best-case scenario, the recommendations I would give, you'd need to have to start yesterday. You need to work with Europe to find a way to renegotiate the accord or to fix the accord, or at best, get a follow-on agreement on some of the other threats Iran poses, fix the sunset clauses so you're not hampered in by this 10 to 15-year thing. I think, many people who even negotiated the deal, they are worried about the sunset clauses in the deal making the Iran agreement terminate on their watch or on the watch of their political party, for instance, and they don't want that. And so there is momentum now to get pressure to get Iran to renegotiate some of these sunset clauses. If that happens, great. If Israel is able to deepen its relationship with some of the Arab states in the periphery, that would be great. But the question is, to me, at what cost right now? Because an increasingly emboldened Iran, one that is not checked across the region, one that doesn't really have its nuclear program frozen and rolled back, then we're back in the world of playing a delaying game again. And whatever success we could read into that, and the alliances that would form, or the balancing coalitions that would form, it would still come at a very high cost. And ultimately, Iran is a country which, under two different regimes, has pursued a nuclear program, and it's had an interest in a nuclear capability in one shape or another since 1959, in a pro-American direction until 79, and in an anti-American direction since 79. I think a strategic victory for the Islamic Republic would be to say one day that they have a nuclear weapons capability, and that despite all of this balancing, despite all of these coalitions, despite all of the sanctions and the pressure and the alliances and the intel sharing, that a country like the Islamic Republic somehow bested the rest of the international community. And I think that would be a strategic setback.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Iran Analyst with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much. This is a fascinating and ongoing topic, and certainly timely, and will remain so. I have a feeling we're going to be revisiting this with you over the course of the coming years. For now, thank you so much for the update, for the expertise, and we hope to have you back here again on High Desert Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry to have ended on a negative note, but I think that only underscores the sense of urgency that exists to fix the deal and to improve the U.S. and our allies and partners' position in the region so that we can offset that possibility as far as possible and as best as possible.
Absolutely. I think it's not negative, it's realistic, and I think it's important for those of us who have a vested interest in the region to know what we're facing and what our leadership is facing in terms of the decisions that have to be made right now and into the future. So thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been great talking to you.
That's it for this edition of High Desert Radio. Thanks so much for listening. High Desert Radio is the voice of the Jewish Federation of New Mexico. Remember, in order for us to continue providing quality programs like High Desert Radio and to continue our work in service to Jewish seniors, Holocaust survivors, low-income families, children, young professionals, Israel, and more, the Jewish Federation of New Mexico relies entirely on the generosity of listeners like you. Make your contribution today to jewishnewmexico.org. Remember, you can subscribe to this series on iTunes and be sure to visit us at jewishnewmexico.org. Till next time, for High Desert Radio, I'm David Wolf.
Audio Jungle.